Hi, Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and continuing the Silmarillion Synopsis series, we now come to the longest and possibly the most tragic story in all of the Silmarillion of Turin Turambar. Now, this is, like I said, the most tragic story. There's actually, even though it's the longest, there's a longer version of it available in two places. You can get the Unfinished Tales, which contains the Nirnaeth Húrin, which is Elvish for the tale of the children of Húrin, and the Children of Húrin, which was published much later, which basically kind of takes the Narn and makes it into basically just a novel treatment of the story. So it's a really good jumping in point if you're interested in picking up the Silmarillion, but you're not sure about it because you've heard all these really scary things about it. That would be maybe the easiest entry point, is getting into this particular story by one of those two means. Regardless, if you're into Shakespearean tragedy, this should be right up your alley. But it's really long, so let's get going. Our story, of course, basically begins in the previous chapter on the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, which covered the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, where Húrin is taken captive by Morgoth, and Húrin, you may remember, is the Lord of the Men of Dor-lómin, which is the House of Hador. Húrin is taken captive and basically told by Morgoth, since he won't reveal the location of Gondolin, I'm going to curse your family and make you watch what happens. And that is kind of the intro to this story, because this story takes us through the life of Turin, who is his son. Húrin also had another child named Lalaith, meaning laughter, but she had died previously of a plague that had come through before the Nirnaeth Arnoediad. And so that leaves Turin as the only child. However, his mother, Morwen, when Húrin goes off to war, is pregnant with a third child on the way, and so she's about to have this third child when Húrin goes off, gets captured, and the entire disaster of the Nirnaeth happens. When Morgoth sends all of the evil men who had, helped him in the battle to Hithlum, basically says, here, you can have this crummy piece of land that you didn't really want as a reward for helping me out, they start oppressing all the people there, including, well, I mean, mainly the men, because the elves have mostly gone off and died or been taken as slaves to Angband, where they're helping Morgoth do whatever he wants them to do. The men, which, when I say men, it's really old men, women, and children who are left in Hithlum and Dor-lómin, they're being oppressed. But weirdly enough, they have this scary feeling about Morwen, that she's connected with elves and has witchcraft powers, because her appearance is very much like an elf. And so they're kind of afraid of her. They don't bother her too much. Nevertheless, because they don't really have any help and everything is gone so badly, they're in really bad straits because they're just destitute at this point. She has a little bit of help from a kinswoman named Idrin, who is taken to wife by one of the Easterlings named Broda. That'll become relevant later in the story. But at the point where the story kicks off, really, she is in a really bad way, and she is planning to send Turin to Doriath to be fostered there, because she is kin to Beren, and she hopes that through that kinship, her son Turin will have a little bit of entree into Doriath, that they won't mind taking him in. So she sends Turin off before her third child is born, and sends him with two older servants to Doriath. He eventually does come to Doriath, and King Thingol, who hears of the plight of her and Turin and all this, decides that he himself will foster Turin. So this is kind of a good turn for Turin. He also sends messengers back to Morwen saying, you come too. I don't want you staying over there, where things are really bad. Morwen, however, has just had her child, and she's not really in a position to travel, and she also doesn't want to leave the land of her fathers and her family. And so she declines, but she does send the dragon helm of Hador, which is the heirloom of the house, basically, and says, here, give this to Turin when he's ready for it. So Turin receives the dragon helm through Thingol, who basically kind of holds it for him for a while. But Morwen doesn't come, and naturally Turin is not extremely happy about that. He grows up over the next 9 years and becomes a very strong and also very handsome person, and he's very apt to learn and whatnot. He's a pretty significant person. And at the end of that 9 years, by which point he's 17, he asks, well, actually, before he asks Thingol the next favor, at some point during this period, Thingol had been sending messengers back and forth to Morwen, and eventually the messengers stopped coming back, and he wouldn't send any more because he's like, okay, something really bad has happened, and I'm not going to send any more people to just get captured or killed. And Turin's really upset at that, and so he ends up asking Thingol, look, I want to go out and I want to be with all the March Wardens and fight orcs on the borders. So Thingol basically agrees. He gives him weapons and whatnot, and he goes out and he starts living out on the marches, fighting orcs and evil men and whatever else comes around. After a few years out on the marches, where he spends a lot of his time with Beleg Cuthalion, which means strongbow, you may remember Beleg and Moblung were the only two people from Doriath to go to the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, and they did escape. Beleg is basically the chief march warden, and he becomes friends with Turin. He spends a lot of his time there, but at the end of about 3 years, he comes back and comes to Menegroth, the court of the king, and he's looking pretty disheveled. He's been out warring and doesn't look all that great, but he's eating in the king's hall because he's the foster son of Thingol. Thingol has a counselor named Cyros who is a little bit arrogant and kind of a jerk, and he starts making fun of Turin's appearance, and he even casts aspersion on the women of Dor Loman, basically saying, if this is what the men like, what do the women do? Run around clad in nothing but their hair? Turin, of course, who loves his mother, takes this very seriously and throws a cup at Cyros's face and really wounds him. And then he stalks out of the hall, realizing that probably shouldn't have done that. The next day, however, Cyros tries to get his revenge and tries to ambush Turin while he's walking around. But Turin, being the really strong man that he is, actually managed to turn the tables on Cyros, forces him to take off his clothes and run through the forest, with Turin chasing him at sword point, basically. Cyros stupidly manages to run over into a ravine, falls, and gets himself killed. And there are a couple of witnesses to what had happened, but none of them are really on the scene. Moblung, however, the captain of Thingol's people, kind of comes up and basically says, I have to take you to King Thingol to address this. And Turin, who assumes he's just going to be found guilty, not realizing that there are witnesses in his favor, basically says, I'm not coming. And he says, you can try to stop me if you want to, but I'm leaving. And Moblung doesn't really try to stop him because Turin basically just runs off and he's too fast. But he carries word back to Thingol, and the witnesses do eventually come forward. And the witnesses basically say, look, it wasn't really Turin's fault. Cyros kind of fell, and it wasn't Turin trying to kill him. And also what Cyros did beforehand really kind of set himself up for what happened later. So Thingol basically says, for any wrongdoing that Turin actually did, I pardon him. He's fine. Can you go find him and tell him that he's welcome to come back? Meanwhile, Turin has gone off and joined a bunch of outlaws in the woods, and those outlaws are not the nicest people because they basically will kill and rob anybody, elf, man, orc, doesn't matter who they are. While with these men, Turin calls himself Nathan, the Wronged. And you'll notice a trend in this story that he takes a lot of different names to himself, so kind of keep track of all that. It becomes interesting. Meanwhile, Beleg is the one who's trying to locate him, and eventually Beleg does find the camp where they're staying, but the men are, well, Turin is away from the camp at the time, and the men who are there capture him and basically torture him or treat him cruelly in some way. And then when Turin returns, he sees who it is, and he's like, you shouldn't have done this. This guy's my friend, and he's really sorry. And Beleg kind of convinces him after this, at least, don't live like a complete outlaw, just hunting everybody. And Turin basically decides, well, I'm just going to hunt only the servants of Morgoth. He can't, however, convince him to come back to Doriath, even though he basically conveys the pardon of Thingol. Turin is just a little bit too proud for his own good to accept the pardon. Beleg at this point can't really bring himself to stay with the outlaws And so he basically tells me, look, I'll be fighting on the marches of Doriath if you want to find me. And Turin says in response, well, you can find me on Amon Ruth, it's just a hill that he just happened to see in his vision. And he didn't really know why he said it, but it does become significant just a little bit later, because after Beleg returns to Doriath, Turin and his men do actually end up wandering in that direction. But first let's find out what Beleg's been doing. Beleg returns to Doriath, tells Thingol about the fact that Turin won't come back, and he basically says, I kind of want to go back and help him, and Thingol says, I'm fine with that, and I'll give you a gift, to help you pick anything. And he says, well, I'm going to be fighting a lot of orcs on the marches, and so because things are getting really thick and heavy and my bow is not necessarily the best weapon at close quarters at this point, I want a really good sword. And so he picks a sword called Anglachel, which is a really unique sword. It was forged by Eol, who you may remember is the dark elf who is the father of Meiglin, who ends up in Gondolin. And it was forged out of the iron that was found in a meteor, and it's a black sword. It doesn't look like regular iron, but it's a really, really dangerous weapon. Melian, who is, a Mayan, kind of knows things, says that you might not want to take that one. It has the dark heart of its maker in it, and it won't love the hand that wields it, and it won't serve you for long either if you take it. And Beleg said, well, I'll wield it while I may, nonetheless. Melian also gives him Lembas, which she basically says he can share with Turin or whoever else he wants to share it with, which is a big deal because it tells us in the story that never before this has Lembas ever been given to anyone outside of the elfin race. So for a while, Beleg goes back to the marches and fights orcs and whatnot. But then when winter comes and the fighting kind of slows down, one day his comrades just realize he's gone, and he's gone back to try to find Turin. Now let's find out what Turin's been doing. Turin and the outlaws, meanwhile, of course, did move kind of in the direction of Amon Ruth. They had been getting more and more harried by the servants of Morgoth, and they were looking for a safer lair. And while doing that, they run into 3 dwarves that are just kind of out in the open. And one of the outlaws, when the dwarves basically run away, one of the outlaws shoots at one of them, but it's not clear whether they hit him or not. And then one of them they catch. And the one that they catch turns out to be a dwarf named Meme. And Meme, basically in exchange for his life, says, I'll show you where my hidden lair is that nobody can find on Amon Ruth. So guess what? They go to Amon Ruth. And when they get there, they find out that the arrow that was shot actually did hit one of the other dwarves. Turns out to be Meme's son, one of his 2 sons. The other son, the other 2 dwarves are both his sons. And unfortunately, he dies. Húrin is really upset. He didn't really want that to happen, and he basically says, I'm really sorry, and if I had money, I would give you a weregild, a payment for your son's loss. And if I ever do come into, any kind of fortune or anything like that, I will pay you a ransom for your son's life. Mim is somewhat assuaged by this, but in the meantime, the outlaws do end up living there, and it turns out Mim himself is what's called a petty dwarf. Basically, they were dwarves that were kind of not liked by some of the other dwarves and kind of went out on their own. And some of these dwarves, in fact, were some of the first people to start digging the caverns that would eventually become Nargothrond, which is where Finrod Felagund made his kingdom. So that'll become relevant later on, but you need to know that. So they find out all this, and they're staying there for quite a while. And one of the other interesting things that happens here that will become relevant later is Turin, while staying there, for some reason his eyes seem constantly drawn to the woods of Brethil, which is near Doriath, but he doesn't know why he keeps looking there, but keep it in mind for later. Beleg eventually finds Turin because he knows to look at Amon Ruth, because that's what Turin had said, not realizing what would happen, and he brings him the dragon helm. And so Beleg becomes eventually well liked by the outlaws. He helps them out, he heals them, brings the Lembas, he helps them quite a bit. And he still can't convince Turin to return to Doriath, so against his own better wisdom, he stays basically trying to keep Turin, in as good a position as he can. So they keep waylaying the servants of Morgoth, and it kind of spreads a rumor around that the dragon helm and the bow that had been fighting in the the marches of Doriath have risen again at Amon Ruth, and that starts to lead to Morgoth sending more and more people. So also at this point, Meme is not too happy because he doesn't like elves. He thinks that elves have kind of treated his people badly, and having been involved in the delving of Nargothrond, he thinks that Finrod and the other elves just kind of stole it from him, and he doesn't like Beleg. Turin during this time again renames himself Gorthal, which means the Dread Helm. Morgoth begins sending spies to Amon Ruth, and they eventually capture Meme, who, under threat of torment, basically says, okay, I'll show you where, my hidden lair is. It's the second time he's had to give it up basically to save his own skin. And as a result, of course, Turin and the outlaws end up being surrounded, and pretty much all of them are killed. Turin, however, is captured alive because that's what Morgoth wants. He wants his curse to play out as long as it possibly can and do as much damage as possible. Beleg, however, is not killed. He was just really badly wounded. And Meme, who was kind of left there on his own, sees Beleg is still alive and tries to kill him, but Beleg basically gets up and scares him off. Beleg has to spend some time healing himself because he is badly wounded, and eventually brings himself back up to a state of health that he can chase after Turin, who is now with the orcs way far ahead. So he sets out, starts following the trail. Beleg follows pretty fast, and because the orcs don't really have anything to worry about, they think they're all fine, they're not going particularly fast, and he eventually catches up in a wooded area, and when he is getting fairly close but still doesn't know where they are, he runs into another elf who's just kind of sitting around, leaning up against a tree, and basically asks him, well, who are you? And it turns out that it's Gwyndor. Gwyndor, you may remember, was the Nargothrond elf who led a contingent against Orodreth's better judgment into the Nirnaeth Arnoediad and went way ahead into the battle and tried to kill everybody and got basically cut off at the gates of Angband. Turns out he's escaped and is trying to make his way back south. And Beleg basically says, well, I'm trying to get this guy out of the clutches of these orcs. Can you help me? And he's not really happy about the idea because he thinks it's way too risky, but he's like, okay, fine. Beleg uses his bow to take out the wolf sentries that the orcs have around the camp. And then when the orcs are asleep, they basically sneak in, let Turin loose of his bonds or whatever, and then carry him out. He's passed out from exhaustion and being tormented and everything else, so he's no help to them. They carry him out, and there's a storm coming, and while the storm is on its way, Beleg Cuthalion is trying to cut the rest of the chains off of Turin with the sword Anglachel, and unfortunately, whether because of the malice of the sword or just bad luck, he manages to accidentally cut Turin in the process. This wakes Turin up, who assumes, of course, he's still in the middle of an orc encampment and being tormented, but he finds that, oh, look, I don't have any, nothing's tying me down. And so he jumps up, wrestles Beleg to the ground, takes the sword, and kills him before he realizes what's really going on. Meanwhile, the storm has come up, and then the lightning flashes, and he sees what he's done, and he's just stricken dumb. He's basically shocked into craziness. Gwyndor can't get him to move or do anything, but luckily because of the storm, the tracks are covered, and the orcs can't find him, and they're kind of too scared to look for him anyway because they're in a part of the woods they don't really like. So they actually end up leaving without searching for them. Gwyndor eventually gets Turin to help him bury Beleg, and after they do that, he leads them out, but Turin's basically just letting him lead him on like he's blind, deaf, and dumb, doesn't really know what's going on around him. He eventually takes him to the lake of Ivrin, which is the source of the river Narog, the Narog is the river on which Nargothrond is built. The caverns of Nargothrond are on one side of the river Narog. And he says that, Ulmo protects the Lake of Ivrin, and he has Beleg drink, and when he does, this kind of restores him to his senses, and he finally, he just breaks down crying because he's realizes what he's done. And after all that, Gwyndor finally gets to actually have a reasonable conversation with him and says, look, we need to get out of here. We're going to go to Nargothrond, where I'm from, and we can at least be safe. When they arrive in Nargothrond, Gwyndor at first isn't even recognized because of all the torments he's undergone in Angband, but Finduilas, who is the daughter of Orodreth and therefore the princess at this point, does recognize him and basically lets everybody know, oh my gosh, it's Gwyndor. And so they're accepted into Nargothrond. Turin, again trying to hide his identity here, changes his name and basically calls himself Agarwine, son of Umarth, basically bloodstained, son of ill fate. And while he's there, he also has the sword Anglachel, which has become kind of dull over time, reforged, and renames it Gurthang, Iron of Death. The elves themselves end up naming him Adonethel, which basically just means elf man, because he's the best looking man there is, and he actually looks kind of like a Noldorin elf. And also they end up naming him Mormagil, meaning the Black Sword, because of his prowess in battle. So he acquires a lot of new names during this period. During this period, Finduilas, who had originally loved Gwyndor, no longer really does, in part because of just how misshapen he's become. And I don't mean physically misshapen, but just in terms of his spirit and in terms of just his torment. But now she's actually kind of drawn to Turin, and she doesn't even want to be, and she feels guilty about it. Turin, however, doesn't seem to notice. Gwyndor, who does, takes her aside one day and says, look, I understand why you don't love me anymore, and I don't fault you for it, but Turin, getting involved with him could be dangerous. Just mixing elf and man together is probably dangerous in general, and it really isn't probably going to happen very often unless there's some major fate involved, like Beren and Luthien, and Turin is not Beren. Finduilas basically says, well, Turin doesn't love me anyway, so it doesn't matter, and she's kind of just becoming depressed over time because of that. Gwyndor, however, also revealed Turin's true name to her, and it doesn't really mean much to her, and it doesn't matter much to her, but Turin learns that he's revealed his true name, and he gets mad, thinking that this is going to bring the curse of Morgoth onto him again, and Gwyndor basically says, your curse is on you, it doesn't have anything to do with your name, don't blame me for that. Oddly enough, when Orodreth finds out who Turin is, he actually holds him in greater honor as a result, and Turin more and more finds himself in the high councils of Orodreth. And being the warlike sort that he is, he's always in favor of more open combat and doing, really major things, as opposed to living by stealth, which is what they've been doing ever since Beren came and, Celegorm and Curufin had that whole big speech about how this was going to be so dangerous. And furthermore, Turin ends up basically convincing them to build a bridge across the river Narog from Nargothrond so that they can more easily get large armies out. And unfortunately, this kind of reveals through all of this to Morgoth where Nargothrond is. And this is where the story starts getting worse. Although, before we get to the really bad downturn of the story, Morwen, during the period where Turin was doing a lot of major combat operations in Nargothrond, actually does manage to come with her child, Nienor, named Morning. She actually does come to Doriath because everything that Turin had been doing actually kind of made Morgoth's servants back up just a little bit, and so she had a clear path to get to Doriath. When she gets there, however, she finds out that he's been long gone. Now, before things get really bad, there are a couple of elf messengers who come from Círdan the shipwright, and they basically tell Orodreth, look, we've had messages from Ulmo that things are about to get really bad. We have word of a large host mustering in the north from Morgoth that's going to come down south, and Ulmo says you should stop being so prideful and get rid of that bridge. Turin, however, isn't hearing any of it, and he's basically kind of kind of casts aspersions at the Valar, saying, we only have to deal with one Vala, and that's the one in the north. Why should we care what Ulmo says? At the end of the day, they don't throw down the bridge. And so eventually what does happen is there is a really large army coming south, and it's being led by Glaurung the dragon. And basically Glaurung, on his way, defiles the lake of Ivrin, where Turin had managed to regain his sanity by drinking the water. He completely defiles that area and keeps coming south. Turin leads with Orodreth, an army out of Nargothrond to meet this orc host, but because Glaurung is there, they can't really withstand them. Turin is the only one that can seem to stand against him because of his helm, which is a dwarven helm, and you may remember from the Nirnaeth chapter that dwarves have helmets that kind of help them withstand the heat of the fires. So Turin can kind of stand against him, but nobody else can, and basically the army is just withered, and it gets trapped in between the arms of the two rivers and basically just completely decimated. And Gwyndor is mortally wounded. Turin pulls him out of the battle, takes him aside, and Gwyndor basically tells him, I kind of wish I hadn't rescued you. But if you want to defeat your own fate and escape your curse, make sure you save Finduilas. You may not have any feelings for her, but she's the only thing that can save you from your fate. And so he dies. Turin basically turns back to Nargothrond to go get there as fast as he can and save everybody. But by the time he gets there, Glaurung and the orcs have already started ransacking the place, and of course they were basically undefended, and the ones that were still there capable of defending it didn't realize they were coming and were taken kind of unprepared, and so they're already taking captives and everything else. Turin comes up, and he actually gets ready to just charge Glaurung. Glaurung, however, taunts him into taking off his helmet and looking him in the eyes, which turns out to be a mistake because Glaurung has this, because of the evil spirit inhabiting his body, kind of magically holds Turin in place. And this sounds familiar if you've seen Peter Jackson's Hobbit movies, because they kind of did this with Smaug. That never happens in The Hobbit, but I have to think that they got this idea from the Turin Turambar story. But basically he's like holding him in position, and basically all the captives of Nargothrond are being carried out while Turin is just forced to watch. And Glaurung, meanwhile, is just taunting him with all of his misdeeds and making him see his entire life in a really distorted, misshapen way to make him think that everything he's done just is horrible. And at the end of it all, he basically says, you deserted even your own family. Your family's up in Dorloman being miserable while you're living as a prince in Nargothrond, ingrate. And so he's taunting him about his family, trying to make him forget Finduilas. And once all the captives are gone, he releases Turin. Turin then basically tries to attack Glaurung again, and Glaurung is like, well, I'll give you bravery, but you're not going to beat me, and you're only going to let, your family suffer even more if you die. And he basically fools Turin through combination of just language and also whatever he did with his mind spell. And Turin decides that he's got to go back to Dorloman right away, and thus he does not follow Finduilas. Once Turin leaves, Glaurung basically chases all the remaining orcs out of Nargothrond and says, you can't keep any of the gold, it's all mine, and he gathers it into a hoard and lays down on it. But we'll come back and meet him again. Turin now goes north towards Dorloman again to try to find his mother and sister, and he passes by the lake Ivrin, finds it defiled. And I mention this mainly because this point will come up again in a later story, so keep that in mind. But he eventually does come to Dorloman, looks for Morwen, can't find her. So he's looking around, trying to find out what's going on. He comes to the house of Broda, and he finds out there that Morwen had, left, and only Eirin, her kinswoman, really knew where. So he threatens to kill Broda, and Eirin basically says, look, she went to Doriath, you idiot. Don't, go find her, and he realizes at this point that Glaurung had basically lied and got him to do the wrong thing, and in his absolute rage at finding out this, he kills Brada and other people in the hall and then just flees, which doesn't make life any easier for any of the remaining people of Dor Loman. So he ends up leaving Dor Loman, but he decides not to go to Morwen in Doriath, thinking, well, everywhere I go, bad things happen. I'm going to leave them safe in Doriath behind Melion's girdle, and I'm going to go chase down Finduilas. So he does. But he doesn't catch up with them. He ends up coming to the woods of Brethil, and in the woods of Brethil, he comes across a group of the men who live there being surrounded by orcs, and they're about to be wiped out. But he saves them, coming in at the last minute, and he finds out from them that the orcs that had taken the people of Nargothrond captive actually did pass through there nearby, and he asks them about tidings of Finduilas, and they say, well, yeah, about that. She was basically, when we attacked the orcs trying to rescue the captives, they all kind of just killed the captives, and they pinned her to a tree, and the only thing we got out of her was, if the Morgil comes here, tell him that Finduilas was here. And they had buried her on the spot, basically. They take Turin to the grave, and again, for like the second time, he's just kind of overwhelmed with grief and basically passes out. They take him back to their leader, Brondir, who is skilled at healing, and he, looking at Turin, he's like, I have a bad feeling about this. He's got a sixth sense kind of going about it, but he heals him anyway, and when he finally recovers, they realize who he is. He's got a black sword, and, he's the Mormogil. So they realize who he is, and Brondir's not too happy about it, but he decides to say, he again changes his name to Turambar, which means Master of Fate, and he decides to just live with the men of Brethil. However, in fighting with the men of Brethil, he does decide that he's not going to use the black sword because he doesn't want to be discovered, again, because at least learned some lesson from the whole fiasco at Nargothrond. So he just starts wielding the spear and bow instead. Meanwhile, Morwen and the rest of the people in Doriath find out about the sack of Nargothrond, and some of the escapees come and tell even more details, including the fact that the Mormogil was in fact Turin. It kind of became widely known among the people of Nargothrond who he was. Morwen, therefore, wants to go and find out what happened to him, because there's a lot of conflicting stories. Some people say the dragon killed him. Some people say he's just enchanted standing there like a stone. Some of these are all kind of half true, but none of them have a really clear story, and there's a bunch of different contradicting ones. So Morwen decides, I'm going to go find out for myself, and she just rides out alone, leaving her daughter in Doriath. Thingol basically tells Moblung, look, go out and catch her, bring her back. This is a stupid idea. He rides out to get her and catches up with her and tries to get her to come back. Nienor had also snuck along with the party that Moblung took, hoping that Morwen would come back when she realized that Nienor was with them. But Morwen just isn't going to turn around, so Moblung basically has to help her out, and he's like, okay, fine, we'll go to Nargothrond, this is a bad idea. And he goes with them. They go to a hill that's near the city, and he basically says, wait here, I'm going to go look ahead, see what I can find out. Glaurung, however, knows of their approach, and he comes out and with the heat of his own fire basically creates a huge amount of steam. Moblung is sneaking down at, near the gates of Nargothrond, but this steam covers not only him, but also the hill where the rest of them are waiting, the whole party. And the steam has the stink of dragon in it, and it scares the horses off, and so the party is mostly scattered. Morwen and Nienor also get separated, and they're trying to find each other. Nienor ends up trying to come back to the top of the hill after, regaining some control or getting thrown from her horse. And she comes to the top of the hill, and she crests it, and there's Glaurung's head. He's just kind of laying there, waiting for her to crest the hill. And while he's laying there, she looks at him, and she looks into his eyes, and we know what that means. So basically, not like what he did with Turin, but basically he makes her forget everything. Everything is just blank. And after that, she's just kind of, it's like she can't see. It's like she can't hear. She'll walk along if you, grab her hand and lead her, but if you don't touch her, then she just stands there, and she's basically a blank slate. So Moblung, who had managed to sneak into Nargothrond, found nothing there, eventually comes back to the hill, finds Nienor, and he's like, oh, this is a bad idea. And so he takes Nienor thinking, well, we're probably going to die out here in the wilderness because we've got nothing. But he manages to find a few of the other members of the party, and they have some supplies. So they're like, okay, we might be able to make it back to Doriath. Let's see what we can do. He can't find Morwen, though. Doesn't know where she's gone. Carried off by her horse, who knows where she is. They start making their way back to Doriath, and in the process, they eventually get ambushed by orcs. And Nienor, of course, has been basically a blank slate this whole time, doesn't really know what's going on. She won't talk. She doesn't seem to see. It's not really clear what's going on in her. But when the orcs attack, suddenly she wakes up and screams, and she takes off running, and running faster than anybody can catch up with her. The Moblung and his elves manage to kill off the orcs, or at least escape them, but they can't catch Nienor. She runs so fast, and she basically, between running through branches and doing it herself, she ends up stripping herself naked, and eventually finds a spot where she just lays down and collapses out of exhaustion. Nienor eventually wakes up and actually seems like a baby at this point. The idea is that she doesn't know language. Everything seems totally new to her. It's like she recovered her sight and everything else. She's looking around and she sees things and she doesn't have names for them. But she has this feeling that there's something behind her that she should know about. And she's wandering around and she doesn't really know how to find food. Eventually, Turin and his men find her because she made it to the woods of Brethil because they were already approaching Doriath whenever the orc ambush happened. Turin tries to find out who she is, where she's from, but she doesn't even understand his language. She literally doesn't have any memory of anything at all. And because she doesn't understand what he's asking, she cries because it's like she knows that something's being demanded of her, but she doesn't know what to do about it. And so Turin names her Niniel, Tear Maiden. And as a result, they can't find anything else about her. They just take her in and basically have to teach her language from scratch. Brondir ends up coming to love her, but she loves Turin. Nevertheless, Turin also loves her, by the way, unlike the Finduilas situation. But she resists the idea of marrying him at first, and she doesn't know why. But they, eventually she comes to accept the idea, and they decide that they are going to get married. So that gets really awkward. One thing I should have mentioned, I forgot about, was one of the reasons that she didn't marry him was that Brondir told her who he was, his true identity, and that made a shadow fall across her mind, but because she has no memory, she doesn't realize who that is, and so she doesn't realize that if she marries him, that'll be incest. Nobody knows. Now, unfortunately, Glaurung the dragon learns of the men of Brethil and how well they're doing at foiling orc raids and things like that, and he decides that he's going to make some hay up in Brethil. He starts moving north, and things are looking bad. There are scouts that show that he's coming north, and they're hoping he's just going to pass by and continue on northward, but it eventually becomes pretty clear that he's not. Meanwhile, there have been more significant orcs coming, and Turin, who had basically as a marriage promise to Nienor given up fighting unless, in defense of their actual homes, was forced to basically take up the Black Sword again and start killing the orcs who were actually encroaching on their own home territory. As a result, Glaurung knows, oh, I know who that is, and so he definitely is coming to Brethil. Once Turin realizes this, he realizes we're all doomed. We can't fight him in open battle. We need to have an evacuation plan, but I'm also going to come up with a plan to try to kill this dragon. Turin basically tells the rest of the men of Brethil, look, the rest of you need to be ready to evacuate and get out of here because Glaurung will just ruin the whole place. But I want some volunteers to go with me to try to kill this guy by stealth, basically. Only 2 men end up volunteering, and they end up going on ahead, and the rest of them, despite his instructions that they should be ready to evacuate, decide, well, at least a lot of them do, to follow kind of close behind because they want to see what happens. And one of these is, of course, Nienor, being known as Niniel. Brondir, who can't restrain any of these people, basically says, fine, you all want to follow Turin, I abdicate my leadership of you people, you're all hopeless. And he goes along with them, hoping to at least try to be with Niniel, or as he knows her. And the only problem is Brondir is lame, and has been, so he can't keep up with everybody and falls way behind. Meanwhile, Turin and his two companions come to a ravine through which a river is running, and Turin decides, based on where Glaurung is, he's going to have to cross over this ravine, and what he wants to do is get down into it, climb up the other side, and be ready when Glaurung comes over and stab him in the belly. Very much a Sigurd and the Dragon type thing. So he decides to go do this. One of the volunteers that came with him basically chickens out. He's like, I don't want to climb that. The other one comes with him, but when they get close to the top of the ravine again and Glaurung starts coming over, he dislodges a rock and it falls on the guy's head and kills him, throws him into the river. So Turin is the only one left. But he gets up there and the dragon stench almost overwhelms him, but with what strength he has, he basically just thrusts his sword as far as he can, which it goes all the way up to the hilt into Glaurung's belly. Glaurung is, of course, taken completely by surprise, and he just lurches and jerks the sword out of Turin's hand. Turin manages not to fall and climbs back up. Glaurung is just having his death throes, and after Glaurung kind of calms down and lays still, Turin thinks he's gone, and he walks up and grabs the sword and starts basically vaunting his victory over Glaurung and calling him names and things, pulls the sword out, and when he pulls the sword out, some of the blood spurts out, and it's somewhat venomous, and at the same time, Glaurung actually opens his eyes and looks at him, and between the two things, Turin basically just passes out. Now, as a result of all the commotion that Glaurung caused when he, was in his death throes, everybody thought that, oh my gosh, he's completely killing Turin and the other two guys. And so Nienor is worried about what happens, and she wants to go find out what happened because she doesn't really want to live without Turin anyway. Nienor, of course, outruns Brondir, who is lame and can't keep up. She eventually comes to the spot and finds Turin laying there and Glaurung apparently dead. So she tends Turin's hand, although he won't wake up. And while she's doing this and worried about Turin maybe being dead, Glaurung wakes up again and starts talking to her, basically tells her who she is and lifts the spell on her. And he mentions, well, he kind of insults Turin in a lot of ways and says a lot of bad things about him, again kind of twisting and distorting. But also he ends with a statement, the worst of his evils you will feel within yourself, basically saying you're pregnant with an incestuous child. And at that point, Nienor, recovering all of her memories, realizes what's happened, and she's like, oh my gosh, what has just happened to me? And Brondir is just kind of coming up at the last minute, but Nienor again runs off, and she decides that she's just not going to deal with it anymore. She jumps off a ravine into the river and kills herself. Turin ends up waking up much later, after Brondir has already gone back and told the people of Brethil what he saw, which is most of the conversation that Glaurung had, and revealed to them, this is who Turin is, and this is who Nienor was, and oh my gosh, we need to get out of here. Turin comes up looking for Nienor, realizing somebody's taking care of his hand, but just left him there, and he's trying to figure out why. He comes back and wants to know where Nienor is and wonders, why are you all here? You're all supposed to be ready to evacuate. Brondir gets all hot and decides to basically lay out everything that Glaurung had just told him, because of course he loved Nienor, and now Nienor's dead because of all this. And he tells Turin what he had just heard from Glaurung's own mouth. Turin doesn't believe it, or doesn't want to believe it, and so he just kills Brondir where he stands, completely defenseless. Didn't merit that at all, but he kills him, and then he runs off just because he's angry. He goes to the burial site of Finduilas, realizing at least Nienor is dead, and he's trying to figure out what he needs to do. And while he's sitting there, Moblung comes up with some men who had been out looking to come meet the men of Brethil to help fight off the dragon, because they had word that this was coming too. And Turin, of course, knows who Moblung is, and he asks him tidings of his family in Doriath. Moblung, in this really awkward moment, says about that, they kind of wanted to find you in Nargothrond, and Morwen is lost, and Nienor ended up running off. I'm not really sure where. And then as a result of this, Turin now realizes that everything that Brondir said was true, and he's just absolutely horrified at everything that's gone wrong in his life. He runs off again, leaves Moblung in the dust, and runs to another spot, and he takes out his sword and basically says, "You kill basically anything you touch. Will you kill me too?" And the sword ominously replies in a cold voice, "Yes, for the, blood that you spilled of Beleg and Brondir slain unjustly, yes, I will drink your blood too." And so he basically puts the sword on the ground, and he just falls on it and kills himself. After all this, the sword, by the way, I should mention, broke when Turin fell on it, which is probably a good thing. Nobody else needs to use that. After this, the elves and the men do come along. They bury Turin with the sword, and they set up a grave marker for him, saying that it's Turin Turambar, and that I think the grave also mentions that he killed Glaurung. And they also put Nienor's name on there, even though nobody knows where she ended up. Presumably she ended up being washed down to the river or whatever, but that is basically the end of the story of Turin Turambar, but it's not really the end of the saga that began with Húrin, as we will see in the next chapter, so be ready for that. So, hope you enjoyed that video. If you enjoy outright tragedy, if you can enjoy that sort of thing. But at least I hope it was a good introduction to the story. Like I said, if you want a really novel-length version of this story, pick up The Children of Húrin. It's a really great read. Beyond that, of course, if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can find me at JRRTLore. I occasionally drop some Tolkien trivia on there as well as sharing my videos. You can, of course, also subscribe to the channel here. Don't forget to click the bell icon. You can support the channel here, and you can find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.